And Ashley, you want to go ahead and get us started?
Yes, I will. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Young, and I'm Vice President of Policy and Engagement here at Interact for Health. And I'm so excited to invite you all to our Data as Storytelling behind the Our Health, Our Opportunity Report webinar from Interact for Health in partnership with Frameworks Institute. Interact for Health, we work to ensure that people in our region have a just opportunity to live their healthiest lives, regardless of who they are and where they live. We advance health justice through grant making, collaboration, learning, convening, and engagement. Here at Interact for Health, we're an independent foundation that works in 20 counties in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. So our team has really been working closely with Frameworks for the past year to really frame our messaging around health justice and explore our role in changing narratives about health in our community. And I can say that this has been an amazing journey. I actually was using some tips that you all will learn today in a meeting that I had yesterday. So you will definitely leave here with some things that you can take away and really to help shape and learn more about changing narrative. And really with our framing has helped our team widen the lens on health and really push back all the stigmatizing and fatalistic narratives that we often have when we talk about issues, when we're blaming individuals for their health and problems, rather than really looking at the underlying root causes and the community conditions that cause them. One of the results of the work was the Our Health and Our Opportunity report, which really aims to reimagine the story we tell about our region, identifying the barriers that prevent people from thriving and really uplifting solutions that really uplifting solutions in the work of our partners working to solve these problems. And so we wanted the report to not just include data, but reflect who we are and who we want to be as a region, and really how we talk about ourselves. And so today, we will share some highlights from Our Health and Our Opportunity report and evidence-based framing strategies behind each section as we discuss a future where everyone in our region has the opportunity to live their healthiest lives. So you are in for a treat today. I'm going to hand it over to our presenters for this afternoon. We have Dr. Julie Sweetland. She's a senior advisor at Frameworks Institute, and Kelly Adcock. She's a senior director of data and learning at Interact for Health. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. If we have time during the presentation, we'll definitely get to them, but also at the end, we have a lot of time that'll be dedicated to Q&A. So have I'll say your notebook and pen. Maybe you don't have a notebook and pen, you have your computer, maybe, I don't know. Grab whatever you need, be ready to take notes and really engage in the conversation. So I'll hand it over to Julie.
Great. Thanks so much, Ashley. And thanks to all of you for making some time in your afternoon. I'm sure you had many places you could be and many important pieces of your work you could be taking up. And I really appreciate everyone for making some time for making room for framing as part of your repertoire as a nonprofit leader, mission-driven leader, and someone working toward greater health, equity, and justice. I am speaking today on behalf of the Frameworks Institute. I see in the chat some of you have heard of us, but in case you haven't, we're a nonprofit that works, we're based in DC, we work nationally and internationally, and we've been around 25 years. We just announced our anniversary today. And we are a group of social scientists and social change strategists who study and share the communications aspects of different social justice and scientific issues. And so I'm definitely speaking today on behalf of our group. I tend to do a lot of the back and forth engagement. We've got a whole team of researchers who, again, are doing the research on how people think about health, public health and health equity topics. And more importantly, how can we change them? And I would love it, Caroline, if you could put the link in the chat to our page of studies. So over many dozens of studies across the years, that our research base includes well over 100,000 Americans just on the querying of how people understand health topics. We have one lesson that overrides them all for the public health field, and that's on the next slide. And it's that we should treat our data a little bit like this teaspoon of salt. Salt, if you add it, right, to any dish, it can bring out the flavors. It can really make it sing. It can make it taste as it should, right? It really can make the dish work. But if you just give someone a spoonful of salt, you're likely to have a pretty negative reaction. Data is like this spoonful of salt. Our numbers are essential. They're an essential ingredient to the narratives we tell about who gets the opportunity to be healthy, how we create those opportunities, and what we're doing to block those opportunities for some. But just on its own, if we are just giving people numbers about health disparities, we know from decades of social science research, we're likely to get some negative reactions. People will fill in story. If we don't give people a story about what those numbers mean, people will fill in their own stories. And they're likely to fill in with outdated and incomplete mental models about individual responsibility and blame for health problems, otherism, or us versus them thinking that places blame and stigma on communities for the health injustices and other forms of inequity they're facing, and fatalism, the sense that problems are too big to solve. It's broken beyond repair. And if government is supposed to be part of the solution, this is a problem we're stuck with. So overall, when Interact for Health approached frameworks saying we're about to come out with this, we want to create the State of Health Equity report for our region. We've got compelling data about what's going wrong and also bright spots and opportunities. Said wonderful, right? But we need to make sure that you're nesting those numbers in narrative. So on the next slide, I've got an example of the type of narrative I mean. This isn't a bedtime story, it's a public health story. Sometimes I like to call this my fail-proof formula for framing, but it's about building up an understanding, offering a setting, and some plot background before you get into the problem that your data is illustrating often. And then warding off fatalism by coming up with a strong recommendation or proposal or showing a solution about what to do. So the nice little rhyming for this is we lead with an aspiration, we move into an explanation, we then offer the complication and end with a recommendation. By an aspiration, I mean some sort of positive statement, maybe a values-based message, but it should certainly be about the desirable state. What are we going for? A cherished ideal, a high-level principle. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in this report in a moment, but these are ideas like opportunity, potential, community cohesion, well-being. Then explanation. It's important to remember that most people don't think about most issues most of the time. And so people do work on fast and frugal, well-worn pseudo explanations for how things happen. They're working off cultural information. When it comes to health, we know people are working off depends on how well you take care of yourself, right? It's not the social determinants of health, it's the two determinants of health: diet and exercise, sometimes smoking, right? And so we know that sense of that personal lifestyle choices are the main driver of health. And so if we're seeing disparities across communities, that means that there's a lot of people, right, in the public imagination. That means there's a lot of people in those communities making bad choices. We need to recognize that will be the explanation people are coming with, and work proactively to provide a different understanding. So we're going to show how things work, what affects what. Oh, back it up for me one more time. And we're going to build understanding of that key process or mechanism. Then we can put on our good public health hats and point out the problem, right? The data goes in the third paragraph in some sense. Show the problem, talking about it in collective and systemic terms. We want to cast it as a threat to our aspirations and values. And then finally, again, we don't want to leave people with fatalism, the sense that the problem is inevitable or intractable. Instead, we need to illustrate or propose a solution to the problem we've laid out. You're going to see this narrative in this report, both as an overarching narrative for the full report, and then you'll see these beats within each section of it. On the next slide, I'll show you the overall arching one. So leading with the aspiration of health justice, the idea that our systems should promote health and well-being so that no person or group is exposed to conditions that undermine health and well-being. And the explanation is that health is what is health, right? It's not just absence of illness, for instance. This is advancing the idea that health is multifaceted. It includes physical health, but also mental, emotional, and social or even civic well-being. And crucially, that health is shaped by the resources and conditions around us. The problem statement advanced by this report overall, both explicitly and implicitly by the data it puts out, by the organization, is that across our region, we have systems, policies, and social conditions that aren't just uneven, but they're unfair, and they're undermining the health and well-being of some groups of our neighbors. And finally, it doesn't have to be this way, right? We have the power, we have the opportunity, we have the obligation to shape systems so that they provide greater health and well-being for everyone. Within this report, we can see that it's organized by causal pathways. And so there's a traditional public health habit of organizing by population and taking data group by group. And what we have found over time is that without a lot of framing around each of those groups and why that's happening, those disparities data can be heard as deficit data, right? So if you're seeing 3 times the level of problem X in community Y, that means that group is 3 times as likely to be making bad choices, right? That's how the public can hear that. If we reorganize by causal pathway, what's the underlying inequity or the overall mechanism or process that's driving the health disparities we see on the surface, right? That's the evidence of those injustices or inequities. We then can do a couple of things. We can help the public get smarter about why those disparities are happening. That reduces blame and stigma. It also increases or opens up the space for wanting to drive solutions. So if you present your data, right, only and always kind of by race, geography, income, we're like, what are we supposed to do? Get rid of racism, poverty, and tell people to move, right? That kind of can be the sense that you leave the public with. But if we talk about the ways things are organized and the elements in society that are creating great health and well-being in some communities and some parts of communities and really undermining that for others, you're showing people where we can intervene and what makes sense. So I'm going to pass it to Kelly in just a moment after the next slide, but you'll see that this report is laid out by those causal pathways. And the other thing you'll see throughout is that we wanted the framing to really show both by organizing it through those causal pathways, but also through our language, our tone, our images, from the title of the report to the very last page and the conclusion. We're building a sense of efficacy, a sense that if we worked on this, it would make a difference. It would make a positive difference. This is work worth doing. Solutions are within reach. And so as you're listening to Kelly, I'll encourage you to listen for these cues of explanation, efficacy, and in a collective sense of power and possibility. And for the rest of this session, what we'll do is Kelly will go through one of those kind of causal pathways and explain, introduce for some of you, restate for those of you that have already taken a look at this work, give some of the highlights of each section. And then Kelly will toss it back to me and I'll say a little bit about why we framed that section the way we did. the evidence behind it, and what we think it will do. So please, again, as Ashley said, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And if we can answer them as we're going along, we will absolutely do so. But otherwise, you'll just be setting us up for a robust discussion at the end of the time together. All right, Kelly, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie, and thanks to everyone for being here. Julie, it's always such a joy to share space with you. We've learned so much in our partnership together. From you, the evidence of framework, it's really changed as someone who's come up in data and public health and sort of has certainly used data to point out those problems and lead with that problem. It's been a journey of unlearning. But I was reflecting even as you were talking about through that data is salt metaphor, this unlearning is so critical if we want our message to land, if we want to elevate communities and really put community and people and solutions and the hope for what's possible that we're all striving for at the center. And so I'm honored to lift up what was a team effort at Interact, many people here behind this report, and sort of share some highlights today. As we kick off, I do want to highlight that the report and all of its assets, there's data graphics in it, the language, the resources, it's all freely available for anyone to use as community assets. So included later in the slide deck, and someone will drop it in the chat as well, as a link to the website that we've created where the report lives, including these assets that you can download, ourhealthouropportunity.org. So let's dive in. We're going to dive into sort of the first part that is the aspiration, that sort of big first beat that Julie was referring to in our report. And we start with this bold vision that every person deserves the opportunity to live their healthiest life. And then quickly just talking people through the complication that in our region, and so for folks that are here or perhaps who are outside of the region, when we say Greater Cincinnati or the region, Interact for Health works in 20 counties around Greater Cincinnati in Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. So that is what we mean by the region. But we, like most places, we have underlying problems. Economic injustice, systemic racism, and other forms of marginalization that are major barriers to our health and well-being. And these barriers shape the experiences of some groups of people in profound ways in our region, which is leading to these large disparities between different places in the region and the health of the people who live in them. But the encouraging thing is that we can do something about it. We know what works and what we can try. So to achieve this vision, we quickly in the report, want to lift up that we must commit to advancing health justice and changing community conditions so that no place or group of people is exposed to conditions that are undermining their health. And so first, just starting with people, actually not starting with the data. Greater Cincinnati is a spectacular place. It's home to in this region, 2.4 million people. And we're all just that. We're all people. We have this shared humanity. We all deserve dignity and health and the opportunity for well-being. So on the screen here, you can see one of the data graphics that we elevated. They're different size circles that sort of represent the approximate number of people living in the region across various demographics, different races, incomes, abilities, sexual orientations, and so on. And so this starts, we start with this because it's a reminder that the data in this report represent the experiences and challenges that we have collectively and individually, and reminds us that the meaning we make from these numbers can encourage us to think about people, which Julie highlighted when thinking about how we represent disparities, but it can encourage us to think about people facing health injustice as our neighbors or as strangers. And so, really, and this goes back tying it into the title, it's our community, it's our community's health collectively. Our report lifts up and is framed around 4 key barriers that get in the way of a healthier and thriving community that you see here. So many in our region don't have the vital conditions for health and well-being in the places where they live, learn, work, and play. Systemic racism and discrimination remain prevalent. Social isolation and loneliness are taking a toll on mental health, and we especially know that that's true for our young people. and too many people feel powerless to affect change in their community. So that's our start of the report with sort of the aspiration and laying out what's ahead. Julie, you want to unpack that a bit for us?
I'm going to unmute and then I'm going to unpack. There's a lot of uns I got to do here.
I like that.
Thank you, Kelly. So I'll just mention a couple of things here as I laid out so much at the top. First is just pointing out that the language we start with has a strong effect on how people understand what comes after. So this is known as the priming effect in social science, that the first thing you hear really influences the interpretation and reaction to language that comes later. And so this is one reason why Frameworks advises so strongly and consistently. We've seen this time and time again across hundreds of studies on dozens of social issues. Leading with a positive value statement really does make a difference, a positive difference in how your information is received for a couple of reasons. Number one, the value statement kind of reminds people of something they already agree with, which then puts people in a let me agree with you mood, right? And so it does have that affective response. Second of all, it is often the values that we are working with folks to adopt as messages frame the issue collectively, not individually. And so that leaves us space, right, to lead to solutions that are about fixing the conditions, the policies, the practices, not fixing the people. And then finally, if you lead with the name of a problem or the name of a group that has been stigmatized and marginalized or scapegoated in society, you are then bringing into mind in your audience all the baggage, right, that comes with that health issue, that topic, or that population. And so talking in these the aspirational terms about every person deserving the opportunity to live their healthiest life. Again, it doesn't lead with a problem, so you're not bringing in the baggage of that problem, and it does all the things I spoke to. Also, just say notice the collective framing and the image that was selected here, right? So the fountain, kind of the prototypical symbol, the Cincinnati, this makes it a civic issue, right? Not a personal, not an individualized issue. And on the next slide, I love, Kelly, the way you explained health justice, and I learned a lot from you all in your thinking about why you've adopted that term in particular. So we all know if we're working in public health or health equity spaces, that a couple of things about that term health equity in particular. Number one, most Americans don't understand the term equity. They think of it as like equity in your home, or how much you don't owe on your mortgage, right? If you sold it and that sort of thing. And so there's a misunderstanding of the term. But we see also it's been politicized and mischaracterized, caught up in the manufactured controversy over so-called CRT or critical race theory, the E and the DEI, right? And the legislation or the politicization that's come along with that has had a chilling effect on it. And so it's kind of vulnerable from the right. And so this term, rather than letting the term be a distraction, Interact for Health has thought carefully about a couple of things. How do we select the words that let us do the work? But then also, how do we get more precise about the work we want to do? And so if you think about health equity as let's ensuring that the outcomes are equitable and the conditions are equitable, here, like health justice is going just a little deeper and really talking about the community conditions and the systems that are causing harm and changing those. And so there was a version of this report early on that explained all that. We're not talking about health equity, we're talking about health justice. We're going to move to this term for these reasons. And so this was where a key framing insight, I think, was helpful. Making your affirmative case, explain your term fully on your own terms, and you don't want to restate basically something you wish people would forget. And so really just making sure that you're making your own case. All right, back to you for the vital conditions for good health.
And thanks, Julie. So we're diving into the first main theme of the report, the vital conditions for good health. And we start right with that shared value that we want the opportunity, we all do, to thrive where we live, work, and play. Like Julie talked about, too often we're blaming individuals, their decisions, their behaviors for poor health, ignoring the larger forces, the community conditions, systems, policies, and so on that are really shaping people's daily lives and opportunities for good or for poor health. And we know that place, this is where we talk about sort of place in geography in this section on the vital conditions, but place shapes health in many ways. For example, having reliable transportation may help someone access a job with a living wage, which helps them afford stable housing and nutritious food. And I think as I was reflecting on, as we were including this in the report, it often, right, as someone entrenched in this work and so passionate about this work, a statement like that seems really basic and rudimentary to me. But I think in working with frameworks and thinking about framing and placing the people who's that we're seeking to influence and bring along on this journey, how powerful that sort of explanation is, was a great unlearning for me. So what are these vital conditions for health that we're lifting up? They include 7 categories that appear here on the left side of the circle graphic that's on the screen. Things like basic needs, work and wealth, housing, nature, and really at the center, the central category being in the middle, being belonging and civic muscle. So in framing this report, we elevated the vital conditions framework, like rather than a traditional like social determinants of health framework, but we elevated vital conditions because it really focuses on, in a simple way, root causes and what it takes to thrive, not just survive. So these vital conditions, they're foundational for their building blocks for communities to reach their full potential. And while urgent services, which are on the far right in red, all of those things in this graphic, things like addiction treatment and homeless services, they're necessary and life-saving in our communities, but they in and of themselves can't produce the conditions for thriving. So as you can imagine, in the report, we found that the systems, environments, and resources that support all of these vital conditions for health, they're not equally or fairly available to all people or places in our region. So we're going to look at data that illustrates that. So the map you see here shows one measure of difference in some of the vital conditions between places in the region. It's using the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, which is a composite measure of community conditions like unemployment, poverty, crowded housing. It also accounts for people who have specific needs, so people without vehicles or people with disabilities. I think it's about 16 sort of measures and constructs that make up the measure. And so you can see here the areas in dark blue. These are the areas with the most social vulnerability. They're most vulnerable to external stresses in our region. And the areas in the lightest green shade are the least vulnerable to external stresses. And I think what's been interesting is our team, and Julie, we dug into it, is that while areas in our urban center and our rural periphery, they may look and feel like different places, and we often pit them against one another, particularly in our culture and our media. But we see here that there's actually residents in these areas are experiencing similar struggles. So much of the dark blue and the darkest green colors that cover those areas, indicating that they have this shared experience of being the most vulnerable to some of these external stresses. And then just wrapping up sort of this first section, we're intentional in the report to not get too far from change and solutions. And so those are integrated in the 4 themes. And we just start with saying here that change is possible. Particularly within the vital conditions, there is a place for every institution and person and community to help strengthen them in our region, but we have to rethink how our communities are designed and the laws that govern them to ensure that the vital conditions are in place for everyone. We do highlight in the report how this kind of work is already happening. We have 8 stories of progress throughout. The one here is around the major movement around housing in the region. and highlights recent legislation passed by the city of Cincinnati that provides legal representation for renters in eviction court. To keep us moving, I'm not going to go into all of the solutions. I want to keep focused on the framing aspects of the report as our core for today, but I encourage you to check out all of the solutions, and they also come with tons of links to resources that are shared in the report.
Yeah, and Kelly, I really appreciate how you all it took some thinking, right, and some kind of additional legwork on your part, but you made sure to include the solutions in each section as well as some summary ones at the end, because often we'll see reports that are 39 pages of sad data and then like a few solutions on page 40, right? And that's just not engaging our communities. It's not engaging our audiences. It's not mobilizing them to action in the same way that we know we can do with slightly different organization. So in this section, I'm going to lift up two things other than that about what I think is really important lessons that we can all take something from in terms of framing. First is the consistent effort in this section, but also throughout, to replace field-specific terms, terms of art, terms from the health or public health space, with everyday language. So as a sociolinguist, I can see the value and beauty in every form of language, including jargon. Jargon has a role, right? Jargon is a field-specific set of vocabulary that lets experts speak in shorthand so they can deal with more complicated or more specific issues. So it has its purpose, right, in our, when we're talking to each other. But when our goal is to use communications to engage people outside, other than ourselves, right, other than kind of the choir, in thinking about a social issue, it's really important that we translate what we're talking about into plainer language. And so, intentionally avoiding the phrase social determinants of health in particular, because that's jargon, we know Americans don't understand it. We're not the only people who have studied this term. Folks like Robert Wood Johnson Foundation have been testing it time and again across the years, and they're one of the groups that was really behind this plain language explanation of talking about the conditions where people live, learn, work, and play. Sometimes you'll see it longer with live, learn, work, age, pray, and play, things like that. But the idea is that it's the place, right? It's the conditions that we are living in, and how does that work? And so using that is really helpful, and adding the explanation along with an example. So in the screenshot I've got here from the Fuller report, really pointing out, right, one of the areas of vital conditions for health that people do understand, right? People understand how food is related to health. So starting with an easily understood, relatable example, and then moving into more complex examples as that section unfolds. The other thing on the next slide that I'll just lift up is that the decision to put this section or this causal pathway first was an intentional one, and one that took some discussion. The data were showing quite clearly that many of the disparities, right, and the inequities that we're seeing across the different health topics, different health outcomes, really were concentrated, right, in people with lower incomes, and people of color, particularly our Black communities. And so there was a real, do we want to start this report with the role of systemic racism and economic marginalization? Because we see that as a key driver and really surfacing in the data. We made a decision to put vital conditions first for a couple of reasons. Number one, as I mentioned before, right, order matters. What comes first shapes the interpretation of what is heard later. And so when on reflection, beginning the report with the vital conditions for health prompts people to think about environments, not individual behaviors. We're going to get to the particular populations that are experiencing higher burdens of health problems, but also facing more forms of injustice. So we're going to get to the people in just a moment, right, in the next section. But priming people to think structurally is a way of reducing stigma and bias against those communities that we know are already stigmatized and often scapegoated. And then finally, we know that if you beginning with a causal pathway that affects many demographic groups, Kelly pointed out it affects rural or communities and urban communities. We can think about how that works. That can help to reduce resistance to explanation of racism as a discrete form of inequity, right? So maybe starting with racism has people say, well, isn't it really about class, right? Or isn't it really about something else? But if you start with this more universal organization and then say, and in addition, right, racism overlays on that, you will see much less resistance among audiences who are not already there, right, with you on the explanation of systemic racism. So it opens the door for a much more productive conversation about that. So let's get into that one. Give us some of the highlights on racism and discrimination and their effects on health in the region.
Absolutely. So starting here with the value, we want to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who we are. So we know that racism, ableism, anti-LGBTQ plus bias, and other forms of discrimination, they're more than individual acts. So they show up in our culture and our media, our laws, our institutions, and that's often by design. So when people are unfairly deprived of resources or opportunities because of racism and discrimination, their financial, emotional, and physical health suffer with repercussions across generation. And just lifting up some of the data from the report, we see that the effects of racism and discrimination can be seen in differences in opportunities and access to resources. So for example, here in this graphic of Black and Hispanic members of our community, they're represented in the dark navy blue and the yellow circles, respectively. They're more likely to have lower incomes, less education, receive food benefit assistance, and live in poverty compared to their white neighbors represented in the lighter blue. So we try to make the point with these data, other data in the report, that these patterns in the data aren't random. And the communities experiencing these problems are not to blame. So instead, these disparities are reflecting the way our systems and institutions are failing to work for marginalized groups and leading into differences in health outcomes, which we do highlight several differences in health outcomes between different groups, but I want to illustrate just one here. And that is focusing on the fact that discrimination has a direct impact on health and mental health in particular. So this graphic shows that LGBTQ plus members of our community, they're represented in the dark navy blue bars that are on the left of each measure. So those folks have higher rates of depression and anxiety, and they're less likely to access mental health care. We elevate additional data in the report for thinking about the many factors that might be behind this. So the harmful rhetoric and policies that attack, dismiss, and further marginalize LGBTQ plus people. We've seen locally and in the nation, there's been an increase in anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. And in fact, in 2023, the number of these kinds of bills that were introduced into state legislatures in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana was 7 times higher than it was in 2018. And that is one factor that's been seen in lots of national research that is impacting the mental health of our LGBTQ plus community. But again, change is possible. So we move into more solutions and talk about how we can all take small and big steps to reimagine our policies, institutions, and culture so that racism and discrimination are no longer undermining health. I want to lift up specifically here that we also highlight throughout the report several data gaps. There's so much data out in the world, but we don't know everything. And specifically in this section, recognizing that disaggregated data will help us better understand the experiences and the unique needs of the diverse people in our region. We elevate a couple data gaps that exist for our LGBTQ plus and Hispanic communities in particular in the region. Julie?
Yeah.
Commentary.
So I think this section turned out, it's really, I think, a model for other organizations there are many organizations that are working hard to shine a light on these issues. And these conversations are necessary. It's not a matter of whether we talk about racism and other forms of marginalization, but how. And I think this report does a really good job of modeling the how. So a few things that I think we can all take from the framing of this into our own work. One is connecting, is offering a clear, concise explanation of how racism affects health. And so we know from the research that we've done that people do have ways to connect lack of resources, lack of financial resources to health. So people say, okay, if you're experiencing poverty, you might not be able to afford good food. That's the first thing that comes to mind. People also do fill in kind of a cultural pathology, like, oh, well, if you grow up in poverty, you might not ever get good health behaviors modeled for you, that sort of thing. It's not the understanding we want, but people do have ways to connect the dots. We've seen in our research, most Americans do not have ways to connect racism, the experience of racism, or structural racism, the effects of structural racism to health. And so doing this is really important. So this explanation that when people are unfairly deprived of resources or opportunities, right, their financial, emotional, and physical health suffer, and the results can reverberate, and then following up right away with that tone of efficacy that there's things we can do. The other thing that I think is really important here is connecting racism and other forms of marginalization, both to each other and to those environments. So one strength of this frame is that it allows for greater common cause and sense of solidarity if people understand and experience themselves as among different communities, right? Well, I'm a person that experiences racism, or my community faces racism, but I'm a person or a group, right, that is more likely to experience ableism, right? It allows, if we're connecting the mechanisms, people can see how they can work together in movement. It also creates space for intersecting identities, right? So we know all of us have, different aspects of our identity, race and ethnicity, language background, gender, sex, and sexuality, so on and so forth. And so when we're talking about this way of, if the problem is a lack of valuing, a lack of dignity and respect, right, based on any of those identities, that's not okay. And so this is a really nice and good opening to that. On the next slide, we get a little deeper into explaining racism, not just naming it. And that sense of just kind of name dropping it is something that when I see it in communications, I really see a missed opportunity, right? There's a group that is, speaking into that space, wants to draw attention to the issue, wants to make sure we're working on redressing racism in all its forms, but miss the opportunity to help people understand what you mean by that. So here it says we may think of racism and other forms of discrimination as sets of individual beliefs and actions, but it's that, and it's much more pervasive, and it doesn't just say there's systemic racism too, right? It really says, what do we mean by systemic racism? So it shows up in our lives in many ways: personal interactions, cultural media representation, our institutions and settings, systems. And then it gives examples. It follows up with a very specific policy example and shows how that has cascading consequences into the contemporary moment. So here, this is really leading people step by step. What do we mean by racism? How does that show up systemically in our policies? What's an example of that? How does that show up today? That's going to be a much more effective framing of the issue than simply naming it and nodding, to a deeply unjust system such as slavery. But that is just very vulnerable in its framing to say, well, that was a long time ago. What does that have for now? What does that have to do with now? And so this framing, it really works intentionally against that. The final thing I'll point out here is that in all of this language around any types of inequities or and injustices that communities are facing, we never just leave it with it's uneven. We really make sure we're showing how something is uneven and unfair. Social science shows people need both of those parts to get to we should do something about it as a society. That both of those parts. Yeah. And Joe, I couldn't agree more. Joe put in the chat that I suspect merely name dropping racism is not only ineffective, but maybe even detrimental to your argument. We've seen that, that you get a backfire effect on that. The flip side of that is that a well-framed introduction of racism is what we've seen the most powerful argument, right, for really creating systemic change. So if you do it poorly, you lose ground. If you do it well, you gain more ground than I think we're accustomed to acknowledging. And then next slide, and this is my last one for this section. I want to call everyone's attention to the titles of the graphs in all of these. You got that little tiny caption at the bottom, figure 7. Wonk, 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 right? It's the typical public health, like what is the data set basically is what it is. But there's an intentional choice here to use sentence titling, right? In bigger font at the top, it's the clear takeaway that we want people to understand based on the data. And so it's not just on this particular chart, but I chose this chart because it had another cool thing in it, which is the data illustrates not just an uneven, right, higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of poor mental health, but an unfair, right, and lack of access to mental health care. So it points to one of those underlying inequities around access, not just the disparity that we see as an outcome from that. So that's a framing technique we can all take with us. All right, Kelly, back to you.
Thanks so much, Julie. So moving on to our third theme in the report, it's all around belonging and connection. We want to be seen and heard for who we are. We're healthier when there's room for all of us to belong. So that's the leading value for this section. We know that research shows that lack of social connection and isolation actually leads to increased risk of dying early, even higher than risks of cigarette smoking. On the other hand, residents living in communities that they find supportive actually live longer and report better overall health. However, we show in the report how over the past decade plus, the number of people living alone in our region, so living by themselves, has been steadily increasing, even outpacing sort of like population increases. And we see that young people report some of the highest rates of isolation and loneliness in the nation. At the same time, membership to social, civic, recreational, and professional organizations has decreased both nationally and in our region. And so lifting up in the data that because of some of these things, our communities are not as connected or supported as they could be. And we see the effects of that play out in many of our mental health outcomes. So the first example of that is some data around depression. We know that many of our family members, our friends, our neighbors are struggling with mental health challenges. We've seen the data, we've read the news, we've heard those calls for the crisis. But trying to nest that crisis in sort of these community connections and belonging and support. So on the graph you see here, you can see the increased rate in depression diagnosis in the region. And in the past 20 years, the number of adults experiencing depression has doubled, perhaps because we're better at recognizing it. We've lowered the stigma, or perhaps people are getting more access. But either way, we have a problem that's playing out in sort of our a key mental health outcome. And then another data point to lift up. And sort of that is the summation sort of looking at health outcomes in this section. We know that premature death, it's not the inevitable by any means outcome of mental health struggles, but these deaths of despair serve as sort of an indicator of the problem's magnitude. And the graph here shows that premature deaths in the region due to things like overdose, liver disease, homicide, and suicide have increased threefold in the region in the past 2 decades. And again, change is possible, not too far from change, but bringing people back in this section that to achieve community conditions that are actually promoting mental health and changing the trajectory of many of these mental health outcomes, we have to start fostering communities of belonging where people feel safe, supported, and secure. So for example, we know that long-term positive relationships among young people and young people having trusted adults are crucial to building that sense of belonging and lead to better health outcomes. In this section, as we're sort of lifting up these solutions that you see here, we're also highlighting a story of progress. So a local nonprofit called Found Village in our region is working to pair young people with coaches and mentors who create a safe space and offer stability and encouragement in their development. Julie.
Thanks, Kelly. So there's a few things in this section that I think are framing strategies we should all be adopting into our repertoire. One is the way that this explanation really connects the dots for people. So if you've been doing this work, you've probably have noticed, and Kelly, you even nodded to it in your explanations for the possible reasons for the increase in diagnosis of depression. We are seeing shifts in American thinking when it comes to mental health. So people are more likely than ever to agree that it's important, that it's an important issue, particularly that it's an important issue facing our young people. And people are more willing to talk about it, to self-disclose, to seek treatment, right, than in years past. But from where we sit in our research, we still see a few mindset shifts that are still needed. And this is work that we can be doing when we have an opportunity like this report to help build up a more productive understanding of the issues. So first of all, we see that people can think about, they hear mental health and they said, oh yeah, that's a problem because mental illness, right? Or mood disorders, right? Oh, depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. So people have a sense of the negative state, but they don't have a great sense of what it looks like in the positive state. And that matters because it's really hard to get from the negative state to any other solution other than treatment, right? And I want all the treatment that's necessary in the world. We want full access for everyone who needs it. But any of us doing the work in public health understand that the real high leverage point is in prevention, right? And promotion of the positive state of good mental health. So without an understanding of what good mental health looks like and why it matters, it's really hard to get to those framing wise, it's hard to get people to those solutions. So here, you can see this language is a real nicely written, clear, descriptive, vivid description of what positive mental health looks like, not just poor mental health. And it connects the experience of positive mental health to social environments and conditions. That's also important because one of the mindset shifts that we need is like, it's not only, right, kind of a genetic predisposition or that sort of thing, but it's the emergence of mental health challenges have social and environmental dimensions to them. It's also, I think what's really well done here is explaining the connection to physical health. And overall, this is a great example of a targeted universalism framing, right? Talking about all, like, what do humans, right, universally, right, we all do better when we feel connected and we have got room for us to belong. And then in the pages that follow, we're going to zoom in, right, on the groups that are being socially, right, told they don't belong, right, and excluded and denied resources. So that universal claim with the targeted analysis of who's being undermined or harmed by what is, I think, a really important framing move. On the next page, we can see here, it's pointing to some of those wider social dynamics. We have seen that when you are talking about those wider social dynamics, such as, kind of the bowling alone phenomenon, decrease in community institutions and things that people join and those sorts of things, that really does destigmatize the issues of related to isolation, depression, anxiety, etc. We have found that talking about the problem of stigma doesn't really do that. It doesn't make it worse, but it doesn't make it better, right? So I think there are times and places where we want to have those conversations about, why we shouldn't stigmatize people who are experiencing mental health challenges. But when your job is to actually do the destigmatizing work, zooming out, right, is the framing that can help you do that. And then finally, and Kelly teed this up a little bit, really showing what does it look like to promote positive mental health and do the work of preventing, right, mental health challenges related to social exclusion or marginalization. So in this section, there are 2 examples and I think links to others that have these nice, vivid, really feel good and very easy to see, and they're very concrete examples of public health solutions, meaning places that they're not about diagnosis and treatment, right? They're not healthcare solutions. They are that, again, shaping those institutions that young people are interacting with. And overall, the images in this section and throughout really enhance that overall frame that the positive state is a sense of belonging and connection, right? And that's what we're going for. If we're seeing depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, etc., right? That's a sign that something's not working and we need to go back to that core mechanism. All right, and then we've got the power, Kelly. Let's do the last one.
All right, the last sort of core theme is around power to shape the world that we want to live in. So the leading value here is that we want to know that we matter, have a voice, and can contribute. It's recognizing that we are and can be part of something larger. When communities have a strong and inclusive civic muscle, people are equipped to shape the community conditions that actually affect their health and well-being. And in this section, it was a huge aha moment for us of recognizing that this is actually the mechanism by which the vital conditions for health that we talk about at the beginning can be achieved. And in the report, we highlight 2 important aspects of civic infrastructure. One, the availability and quality of information, so that's made possible by things like internet, local news. And second, the spaces that are designed for communities to come together, things like schools and libraries and parks. And so intentionally in this spot, recognizing and sort of building, there's tons of resources, particularly in this section, that are sort of lifting up these things from county health rankings, the Health and Democracy Index, but really starting with sort of the community conditions and civic infrastructure that make participation possible. And these things give our neighbors sort of the space to exercise their civic muscle and do things like vote and donate blood and volunteer and even start a community garden. All things that are important to our civic fabric. Yet we know that this is not the case, that many of our neighbors are not able to exercise their power to make positive change in their communities. This leads to an uneven distribution of power and resources across places, and ultimately poor health in areas with the least ability to exercise power. And a couple of quick examples from the data. First, voting. I hear there is an election that's around the corner. But in this graphic, we're sort of lifting up that in the tri-state, the 3 areas that Interact for Health works in, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio, they're among some of the most difficult places for voters to make their voices heard. Looking at the light blue line of dots that's across the center of the slide, you can see here how our 3 states stand relative to other states across the nation. The states where it's harder to vote are closer to the sort of far right side of that dotted line. And what makes something harder to vote are the laws that are highlighted in these red and green boxes that are here. Ideally, all 3 states would have all of these 4 boxes green. We would have inclusive voter registration, things like non-strict photo ID, options to vote by mail, but they're simply not fully in place in all of our states. And what does this have to do with health? The next graphic shows how civic participation, and in these data it's specifically looking at participation in the census and voting, and how that's correlated with health outcomes. So we saw the areas in the region with higher participation, so the dark sort of maroon bars that are on the left-hand side of each measure, those areas with the higher participation have better health outcomes compared to areas with lower participation, which are in the light blue bars on the right of each measure. So again, connecting some of the problem and the conditions that are leading to some of these health outcomes. And again, change is possible. Our communities and our democracy are strongest when people participate and they have a say and they can work together to improve community conditions. So really, you know, in this change is possible, the solutions section, we're encouraging folks to reimagine the systems that exclude people from participating and ultimately are seeding division. And centering people in communities, starting by listening to and amplifying the voices of those who are closest to the problems. So check out the report for more of a deep dive on some of these solutions. And I'll turn it to you, Julie.
Yeah. So I'll just note in the chat that Joe pointed out, this is a great graphic. Would you mind flipping back to the one with the dots across the top? Yeah. I love this. It is a great graphic. Look at all the choices you all made here. So this easier vote, harder to vote visualization is super smart in so many ways. You did not color code the states red, blue, right? Which would have deepened the sense of this being a partisan type of issue. You did not feel compelled to put all 50 states on there, right? You kind of just evenly spread them out across, and you highlighted, right, where this region is in particular. But think about the expressive power of Ohio being closer, right, to Alabama, right, than it is, or Mississippi, and the history we know of voter suppression there, right? That is, I think, a really powerful graphic. Similarly, the color choice, right, on the simple way of showing that there's some similarities, right, in our states in the region, but also some differences. This is really, I think, really well done. I wasn't going to say it, but since Joe said it, I figured I'd say it. I don't know, Joe, if you notice anything else, please put that in the chat. Now let's, can we flip forward to the orange one? Yeah, there we go. All right. So here's what I had prepared to say about this section. It's really keeping the power, the capacity, and the agency of people, institutions, and communities in this picture of what our march toward health justice looks like. And that is really, really important. Public health has a history of many wonderful things. We also have a history of paternalism, right? A sense of we know better. We are the scientists, we are the do-gooders, we are the noble, powerful that want to take care of the powerless, the supposedly powerless, do things on their behalf for their own good. And so this, the way this is written, the way this is framed, and even the fact that this section is central to this report is really countering the field's own tendency to talk about people experiencing high levels of health burdens as passive or helpless. They're just vulnerable, they're just victims, right, of these wider civic forces. And so really remembering that and making that a point, but not doing it in this woo-woo, we can all come together and like take the streets and fix things, right? Really acknowledging the possibility of it, the existence of it, where those bright spots exist, not assuming nothing exists in community, but really pointing out at the same time the real and significant barriers that sap or prevent, like hoard the power, right, in some places rather than others. I also love that this writing the way you've made the affirmative case for what a good civic muscle looks like, it's not written in such an idealistic, like pie in the sky way that it leaves you seeming unrealistically idealistic. We know from our research on how American culture is changing right now that there's a deep sense across ages, across political affiliations, across the nation, this sense that our system is rigged, that it's rigged in the favor of the powerful and wealthy. And who gets filled in, right, as the powerful and the elite differs, right, depending on where you sit politically and other factors. But there is this sense that we've kind of lost the ability for the average person to make a difference, to have agency and power. And so the way this is written in a way, it is voting, it is organizing, but it's the census, it's a school board meeting, it's a community garden, it's donating blood. So it's within reach, right? It's this sense of what we're doing, and then that it's doable. And then you clearly connect that participation and that exercise or that building or that amplifying of power to health. On the next slide, I also noticed throughout that you may notice as you're looking at the report, everyone, the first page or the second page is all quotes, right, from community listening sessions. There are quotes from community members throughout the report for each of the sessions, each of the sections. I pulled some from this section, which really speak to this, but it's these design elements, right, aren't just decoration. This is a way of, again, countering that sense that there's the us, there's the foundation, there's the experts, and there's the them, the people and communities, but this is a shared narrative and one that community members have been, it's shared in community, there are voices in community that are articulating, right, these exact same ideas in their own language, but in equally powerful ways. And then the final thing that I'll note about this section on the next slide is that this is really well done. Like we kind of started, Kelly, your team started with kind of voting type data, like that first beautiful visualization. And we really thought about how important it was to expand people's mental model of what it means to be participating and exercising power in a democracy. So here you see, right, we've got the, like you said, access to news, access to information via and activism opportunities via internet. And so that's pointing that out. There are a couple other ways you do that as well, right, beyond kind of traditional political participation. That's important in this moment, even a week before the election, right? Because we have seen in our research nationally that we are losing, right? The mental model of what democracy means is really contracting in American society. People think democracy means voting. And they think voting is about partisan politics. They're not wrong there, right? And then they think partisan politics is, I don't want anything to do with it, or I'm only interested in my side, right? And so that set of mental models and that cultural logic helps to explain why our research and the research of others who are democracy watchers are seeing, right, kind of an increased openness to authoritarianism among younger cohorts. The kind of sense is, if that's democracy, let's try something else, right? That sort of sense. And so anything we can do to remind people that democracy is not just voting, right? But it is freedom of self-expression. It is the ability to kind of form your own assemblies, right? Are you going to the church? Are you going to the blood bank? Are you showing up at the library? It's these civic institutions that we can participate in freely and voluntarily. All of that is part of it. And so the ability to participate in our public life without any specific title, right? You can just get on the internet and sign a petition, right? Or whatever it is. All of that is a really important part of this frame. The other thing that I'll just say is the fact that, there were, at the beginning, you had your very many vital conditions of health, and that belonging and civic muscle was right in the middle, but you didn't let that be the only spot. You talked about it, right? You gave it its own section, and its order right here at the end. It's almost like a, yes, now go go forth, let us participate, let us gather together, let us build our power and exercise our power. So I think that that framing is really well done. All right, now we're going to do the stark statistic that was going to be the whole beginning of the report, but it's at the end. Let's hear your closing argument, Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely. It is the stark statistic that came out of our strategic planning process that you can imagine has mounds of data as we're trying to understand health in our region. And I think reflecting back on these 4 sections that Julie was talking about in the beginning, right? We laid out our aspiration. These 4 themes are the explanation, and then we get to the big complication here of what does this all add up to and mean. And it's about our community's lost potential. So we're only as healthy as our least healthy neighbor. By not taking action to improve the vital conditions for health, we're tolerating lower levels of health, well-being, and longevity in our community. We're literally leaving years of life, meaningful moments with our family, our friends, and our neighbors on the table. And so one way to sort of illustrate the cumulative negative effect of unhealthy conditions is by looking at how long people live on average, known as life expectancy. And for too long, the greater Cincinnati region has lagged behind the nation in life expectancy. And then when you start to dig deeper into the data, looking at people and the places, here, some groups and places are lagging even further behind. So in this map that you see here, lower life expectancies are represented with the dark navy, and the highest life expectancies are in the lightest green. And we have a 26-year gap in life expectancy across the region, from about 62 years in a tiny census tract in East Newport, Kentucky, to 88 years in a little census tract in an area of Indian Hill, Ohio, places that are just miles apart. And so that is the sort of big problem of the what does this all add up to? But then we move quickly in ending the report by moving from that big problem to overall solutions and sort of this hope of what's possible, knowing that it is our community's health, right? Bringing back our title, conclude by highlighting 2 examples of when our region has actually, this efficacy idea of when our region has come together to tackle, even if imperfectly, tackle complex issues in the past around the opioid epidemic, infant mortality. And it's really, it's lifting up that it's our opportunity to ensure that our neighbors can live their healthiest lives by ensuring that the things that you see here, which are the positively framed things that we've been talking about, the 4 themes in the report, ensuring that these are in place for everyone. Julie, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, sure. So this, in working through this report, we had a lot of thoughtfulness around this big statistic, right? So of course there's the 26 years in difference at the extreme ends of the region. There's also, you can see here on the screenshot, and you can see this in the report, versions of that are specific to people who are Black, people who are in different areas, people with facing the highest poverty rates, and that sort of thing. I'm sure you have other versions of this as well, Kelly, could go on. We thought about, there was an impulse to lead with this statistic. And we decided to put it at the end so that it be, because it allows for, it's a kind of a powerful summation, a closing argument to a strong systemic case. When you have a stark statistic like this, people want to explain it, right? They want to understand why. If you start with this, people will fill it in with individualism, otherism, and fatalism. But here at the end, after we've talked about the vital conditions, really laid out a clear case for the role of systemic racism and other forms of systemic marginalization, talked about mental health access, sense of belonging, connection, and the regional differences and sometimes racial differences in the ability to build and exercise power. right? This says, okay, what does this add up to in terms of health and in terms of life and quality of life? And I think it's a really it's a powerful statistic, but more powerful, I think, here at the end, where it's really hard to explain this away with health behaviors, right? After you've kind of looked at this whole report and the whole argument. So that takes us, I think, nicely into the 10 takeaways for fellow framers. First of all, Kelly already said this, or maybe it was Ashley, but I think it was Kelly, to say that the language, the images, the ideas, the data in this report are intended as community assets. Often at frameworks, people are like, oh, I like that, but I have to write it totally differently. I'm like, no. You can borrow the language. You're not plagiarizing, you're participating in our shared framing strategy, because we know that these reframed ideas only become common sense when people hear them again and again and again from different messengers and different ways. So please use these takeaways, but also think about any of the language that's useful to you, or the images, or the ways of presenting the data. Right, this is it's an open source sort of thing. Remember that order matters. We've touched on that theme quite a few times. The way you begin, the way you end, what goes first, right? Sequence. Leading with the aspirational language, but this isn't the case that there was like some nice fluffy aspiration on the very first page and then it went away, right? By organizing the report, there was aspirational language sprinkled throughout at the beginning of each section. Also, explanation, showing what affects what, and doing that in a positive way, not just explaining the problems, but explaining what it should look like, right? Americans are having trouble imagining a positive future, imagining society going well. If we can explain what that looks like, people can imagine it. We can't get there, right? We can't get back there, or can't get to that spot, right? If people can't imagine it, we need to help fill in that sociological imagination. Nesting the numbers and narrative. While this data was, is robust and accurate, carefully curated, thoughtfully presented, visualized, right? It is in service of a larger narrative, not the narrative itself. And the numbers and the language isn't all about, this is not the health disparities report, although there are numerous disparities and inequities in it. But this is a how can we unlock the potential of our region, right? Report. We're trying to spark a sense of efficacy, a sense of can do, not just urgency. Of course, we're pointing out problems, but we're also pointing out that solutions are available. Those statistics are not individual health behaviors. Maybe there's one or two in there, but generally the data is collective, right? It is public health data, not health behavior data. It is talking about systems and structures. It's not talking about the number of people in the region who are news attentive, right? It's talking about the access to news, right? In different areas. It's a different type of lens on the data. And that was intentional and hard to do, actually, right? We are, our data collection systems are much better set up to report on those individual health behaviors. This is intentionally framed to not tell that story, but to tell a public health story. Intentionally, we showed that a situation is uneven and unfair, and I saw the question in the chat asking for the citation. I will quickly do some Google Scholar searching during the Q&A and see if I can find that citation. And overall, again, we're showing and illustrating collective solutions, lots of stories of how this works, and we are doing this in a way where we're not assuming that people who read this report have any specialized expertise or fancy degrees or anything like that. To the extent possible, this is written in plain everyday language. We worked hard in lots of sections to move it from a 16th grade level, right, down to a 10th or even 8th in some places. And so that is important work. It's often work that we don't do always when we're trying to do something very data heavy, right? But this is data, but it presented in a way that the people we want to mobilize and the people who can use it to take action in their own communities, the hope is that they can understand, grasp, and move with it. So those are the takeaways I have. Kelly, is there anything else before we open up the floor that that you would double click on there or add to the list if we had a dozen things you might say? Anything else about the framing that you want to just comment on now? And then we'll open it up for comments, questions, and reasonably phrased complaints.
Absolutely, all of the above.
Mhm.
So I think one thing is on this side of it, it can look like we have it all figured out. I feel really proud about what the team has put out here, but I think it's remembering and what I come back to is that these are all choices that we can make, both big and small, no matter sort of where you sit. What you may or may not have control over in your organization. There are small things, large things that we can all do when we're thinking about the choices that we're making. Because things like dropping a big statistic just by itself, that's a choice. And these decisions aren't necessarily neutral. So I think that's my reflection is just around the choices that are actually available. And I still, right, fall victim to some of these framing mistakes, and it is a muscle to build. I'd love to invite any questions,
Yeah, please.
comments.
Yeah, and Joe, thanks for coming on camera. It's so nice to remember there are humans on the other side of the Zoom. Well, if you don't have any questions for us, I've got a question for you all. I'm curious to hear kind of all the webinars you could go to, why you wanted to hear one that was nerdily unpacking the framing of a specific report. So if you've got a particular interest, I'd love to hear about that in the chat. Ooh, but we see one from Grace.
Be a question.
Caroline,
Yeah,
what'd she say?
I'll throw this to you, Julie. Often when we are trying to communicate, often online, we have limited space. So how do you suggest painting this full picture for health when you have limited time, space, and attention? What's your advice for us?
Yeah, we are always limited, right? Even this report, it could have been twice or three times as long, right? Quite easily. And so I think there are some simple things you can do, right? If you think about if one of the big narratives you want to tell is what surrounds us shapes us, and the narrative the narrative you're trying to get less in society is individual behavior shape health, right? And so if you're thinking about that as a framing choice, are you showing, let's just look at this image right here, right? These are kids in a public setting, right? They're not in a living room. They are engaged with each other. This is not, right, about eating fruits and vegetables and working out, right? This is illustrating kind of a more expansive picture of health. So there's a lot of framing packed in, even just to that one image. So showing, if your topic is children and families, not only and always just showing, right, the little family bubble, the adorable two parents and the baby with the big eyes. We do love those pictures, but can we zoom out? Can we show families and people in community, in context? That's one simple example of how even in a compact space, you can fit a lot of narrative, right, in there. Good question though, and one we get often. Joe, you're on my planet then.
Yeah, I can expand on that a little. I would say that
You.
the
Yeah.
clients in the public health communication space that I'm in are often like they're not really they want to talk about word choice, right? And I really want to talk about frames. So I love having evidence-based frames that I can then cite because, of course, they're in public health, they're scientists, doctors, whatever. They like things that have evidence, even though they may balk at social science evidence. But yeah, I think one question I had is about this idea of efficacy. I think it's a great frame, something I've tried using. The one challenge is that a lot of the solutions, especially the collective, like systemic based solutions that CDC and other organizations want to put forth, are not the, the evidence for their efficacy is like unsettled science, of course, like it's really emerging. It's hard to make a convincing case for it, where like I think we can paint a picture for how it can look, like an aspirational picture. I have a lot of trouble, um, when we're positing those changes at the end, like it feels like we're using circular logic because we're just like reiterating them, but not actually saying like why they work or that they work or that we're even sure they work.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So, without knowing the specific kind of solutions on a emerging at best evidence base, it's hard to weigh in on that. I will say that I was using the term efficacy not in sense of potency or proven outcomes, but in the sense of can do, right? A sense of locus of control, a sense of feeling efficacious, right? And so that is what I would counsel. We don't only, we want to give people sense that there's a problem so that we have a solution, but we also need to give a sense that there's a solution. Where I thought you were going to go with that is we're in public health, we're in government, so we can't advocate. And so I think there's
That
a
too.
different, that too. So you can point out, it's one thing to say Medicaid in every state should fully cover cessation services, right? That's advocating, right? You're taking a position, you're telling people what you think should happen. It's another to say, right, when people have access to cessation services, they're this much more likely to quit for good and stay quit. Right now, only 28 states fully cover, right, Medicaid or cessation services through Medicaid. So you're kind of begging the question, you're leading to a point and you're pointing out a collective level solution, but you're not actually advocating for it. Luckily, we have these wonderful organizations like Conversion Foundations and Interact for Health that can do that advocacy. So then that's another strategy, right? Is you can be in your lane in terms of government and just make sure you're organizing with allies and lifting up, right? Pointing people to the work that can be much more pointed in its advocacy.
Absolutely. Julie, I want to thank you so much for being here today with us and sort of lifting up as we come to a close, walking us through the report, the decisions that were made, and sharing your wealth of wisdom and research that's behind us. So I want to conclude, we can go to the last slide. The report and resources can be found at ourhealthouropportunity.org. Contact information for both Julie and I. Please reach out to us. I mean it when I say we do want to hear from folks about the report, about what's possible for bringing it to life in our region, and what those next steps could look like. We also want your feedback, so feel free to scan the QR code, and we'll also be sending out a link for feedback on this session. We want to hear what worked, what you liked, and also what didn't, and what we could do better next time. And then we'll be bringing Julie back on November 19th to do a Framing 101. So not necessarily in the context of this report, but just talking about framing 101 level things. So feel free to sign up and join us there. And anything else you want to add, Julie? And if not, I think.
Well, this was like
Thank
framing
you.
like 301 or 401. So,
Exactly.
so you all are up on it, but yeah, please share that. And please fill the feedback. When Interact says they want to hear from you, they really mean it. You all have been a dream date. We're just wonderful, wonderful partners in terms of the work you're doing, the way you interact with each other, and the way you work with partners and grantees. So thank you as well. And thanks to everyone for coming.
Yeah. And slides will be available in a follow-up email. Just got a question. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.